To this day, I can't say for certain exactly what it was, but I know it had sinister intentions. I've been born and raised close to around Ann Arbor, Michigan my entire life and have never encountered anything weird or out of the ordinary. I'm an avid hiker and outdoorsman and have seen it all when it comes to wildlife. I know much of my teenager years and early 20s was riddled with tales of the supposed Dogman that lives out in the wilderness, but I have never encountered such a thing, or at least I thought until more recently. This happened to me just a month ago. I'm still having a harder time processing exactly what happened. I usually like to hike and traverse through miles and miles of wilderness. As I'm hiking through the woods, I just had this odd feeling that I'm being watched, and it's making me more and more uncomfortable as I go on. I continuously look around and check my surroundings, but I don't see anything. After a short amount of time, maybe not even a half hour later, the woods start to get silent. Now, for those of you who aren't exactly outdoors people, this usually happens when there is a large predator in the area, like a mountain lion or of the such. The only thing I can think of, though, would be a black bear, which is the only really kind of bear there is in Michigan. But I seriously doubt a black bear would be stalking me like this. I've also dealt with black bear in the past, and I've never had an experience anywhere close to what I was having with any black bear. I continued to track on back to my truck, having only gone about 3 or so miles into the woods, and that's when I started to smell the sweet smell of death, rotting meat, and wet dog. It was so strong. At this point, I definitely start picking up the pace, and I began jogging back to my truck. I knew whatever I was smelling couldn't be too far away, and as soon as I start jogging, I could hear this thing keeping up pace with me, whatever it was. It couldn't have been more than 20 yards behind me. I pretty much refused to turn around and look, and I literally kept my pace all the way until I made it to the tree line and ran to my truck, and I got the hell out of there. What's weird and also scares me at the same time is that whatever this was, I'm sure could have easily gotten me and taken me out, but it didn't. It just kept pace with me, like it was trying to shoo me off of its territory. It's really going to affect everything now, from the way I hike to where I hike. I guess there's just some things in the wilderness we were never meant to discover. My encounter takes place when I was 19. When I was a little younger than that, my parents split up in a really nasty divorce, but always stayed about 5 or so miles within each other, so that way me and my brother would be able to go back and forth and maintain a good, healthy relationship with both parents. We lived in a smaller town, so a lot of the times we would just walk to the other parent's house. One of the most popular ways we would do this is walk the dike to my dad's house. To give you a little bit of an idea, there's a dike that runs all the way up to the upper part of town where my mom is, to the lower part of town, which is a few miles away. Now, you can take this little pathway, which is right next to the train tracks and a river. This pathway is called a dike, and as you're walking there, there's about a 20-foot clearing on your left-hand side, followed by the woods. On your right-hand side is a little bit of a drop-off by maybe 5 or 7 feet, followed by some train tracks, followed by more brush, followed by the riverbank and then the river. This pathway is pretty long and extends for a few miles, and there's really only seldom few streetlights here and there that are out there. On this particular night, me and my brother, who were 19 and 16 at the time, are walking from my mother's to my father's down this dike. It's roughly about 8 p.m., if I remember correctly. It was definitely dark out, so it wasn't summer yet. Keep in mind we're the only ones out walking this right now, and this is pretty common for us since we walk this dike often, and we know that it's fairly low traffic. On this particular night, though, we were walking, and we start hearing some strange noises by the riverbank. It's not really that uncommon. Sometimes homeless people and younger kids like to go down there and drink and party, so we didn't really think anything of it. But the noises we did hear sounded like a horse or something that large was trapped and trying to get out, or something like that. I really don't know just how else to describe it. It was just very strange, but all I can make out was that whatever was making this noise was humongous. Again, I kept walking and didn't really think too much of it until about 50 or so feet away. This large thing runs up from the train tracks all the way to the dike, right underneath the streetlight. It ran up on all fours, and as soon as it gets onto the pathway, it stands up on two legs and looks directly at me and in my brother's direction. At this point, me and him stopped dead in our tracks and practically pissed ourselves. My brother and I both said werewolf and almost a cry whimper, and I stayed dead silent watching the thing. This thing stood there for about a moment and just stared at me and my brother, and then took 1 or 2 leaps and jumped into the woods to our left. This thing was enormous. At first, I thought it was a wolf or something, but then as soon as it climbed onto the path, I noticed it was the largest dog I'd ever seen. And then once it stood up, I didn't even know what to think anymore, other than a werewolf. It wasn't super ripped or anything, but it was pretty lean and had a more slender, tapered off waist, and I did see a tail that was quite bushy. The head was pretty large and looked very wolf-like. Imagine a timber wolf. And I could see under the light that it had pretty dark brown hair with certain streak patterns that were unique. The scariest thing about it, though, was the way it looked at us. It didn't snarl. It had a sinister smile on its face, like it wanted us to come to it so it could do evil. Its eyes were almost a piercing red. Even now, the story is really hard for me to recall because of just how traumatizing it was for both of us. Even though it only stood there and glared at us into our soul for probably not even 10 seconds. It felt like forever, like it had done what it wanted to do, like it wanted to terrify us and that its mission was complete. As soon as it turned its head and left into the woodline, me and my brother sprinted towards my dad's house. We got there and told him what we had saw, but of course he didn't believe it. He just thought we saw some homeless person or something. Of course, leave it to mom and dad to never believe what you have to say. Me and my brother to this day don't talk about it, and just like to pretend that it never existed. That to me feels like the easiest way to cope with it. My one and only encounter with a werewolf, or so I would call it, was back in 2011 when I was 16. I live kinda out in the middle of nowhere in Ohio, and it's pretty rural out here. I think the closest neighbor is probably a mile, and there's a lot of woods around our property. But I've never had an issue with that before. Anyway, it was a school night, and I was playing some video games before I went to bed. So this is probably roughly 9:30, if I remember correctly. My room isn't the largest, and I have a window that's right next to my TV, so I could see directly out my back window as I'm looking at my TV. So I'm sitting there, and I'm playing my Xbox, and I have a pretty normal, about 5 or so feet off the ground window, and the curtains are open. It's obviously pitch black outside. I see 2 large ears pop up. At this point, I'm only really half paying attention because I'm like, what the fuck? Did some large dog wander by our yard? And then, not even a couple seconds later, the whole head pops up into view, and at this point, I'm screaming like a little girl. This was a huge looking wolf-like face with a massive head that took up almost the entire span of my window. It had the most terrifying looking amber eyes, and it was baring its teeth at me. I think what blew me away the most was how big its teeth were, even though they seemed to stick out of its mouth even when it wasn't baring its teeth. It wasn't making any noise, but after I screamed and stared at it for a few seconds, I ran out of my room and ran to my parents to let them know there was some sort of evil dog outside my window. Of course, my dad thought it was some animal, so he grabbed his rifle and went to check the situation out. But there were no tracks or any signs of an animal had been outside my window. I now keep my curtains closed for the most part. This sighting happened to me back in 1981 in Northern California. If I remember right, I think I was either 11 or 12 at the time, and we lived on some property with acreage out in the middle of nowhere. There's actually alfalfa fields all around where we lived. Our driveway, which is pretty long, I want to say at least 500 to 600 yards, extended out from our house to the road with alfalfa fields on both sides. Now, right around the pathway, there are quite a few trees, big fir trees to be exact. There was one evening I was taking the trash cans out to the very end of the driveway, just dragging them. It's a huge pain in the ass, but I had to do it every week. That was my chore. Anyway, I got both cans to the end of the driveway, and as I started to walk back towards the house, I immediately felt danger, like something was after me. For whatever reason, I don't know if it was instinct or like this creature wanted me to know it was there, but I just happened to look up to my left in the fir tree. And in the fir tree, on a branch, was this hyena-looking creature. That's the best way I can describe it. The face looked very much like a hyena. As soon as I looked at it, it was looking right at me already. And it's not all that happened. It started to lower its head and growl as if I was prey. Apparently, it wasn't too fond of me discovering it was there. After about 3 seconds, the thing jumped from the tree onto the road, and then jumped into the other side of the road, where there's pretty much nothing but thick forest and brush. It was pretty dusky out, since it was the evening, so the only real thing I saw was how large it was, and then that it was a pretty dark color. Maybe like a dark brown, closer to black. It looks like it had some kind of mane, but it was really hard to tell any specific details with how it was holding onto the branch. The branch that was underneath that was a huge thick arm, and it was a part of one of the lower branches that was roughly 20 feet up. I'm still baffled how that tree held on to such a large animal, and I have no idea what it was, but obviously after seeing, I ran back to the house and never told my parents what I saw. Are they really going to believe that I saw a hyena creature in the trees? Probably not. This encounter happened to me as I was on my way through central Minnesota when I was younger, and me and my buddies used to go on hunting trips together all throughout the country. It was October at this time, and we were around central Minnesota during this time. And actually, we were right around the Mustinka River. Now, to give you a little bit more understanding of the area, there's not really a whole lot of trees around, just a lot of tall grass and brush. We were driving through the area, and it was late at night, so it was pretty dark. We were on a long stretch of road, and about 100 yards ahead of us, we see this giant mass jump out into the road, look over in our direction, and then jump to the other side of the road. When it jumped, it paused for a second and looked our way. We were far enough away that we couldn't make out every detail, but we definitely saw more than we ever wanted to. This thing looked like a human-wolf hybrid. It was very shaggy and had raccoon-like hands from what we saw. It wasn't really built huge either. It was very, very lean, but also very tall. Looking back, I can't really make out a lot of other details of the face and head, other than it looked like a giant brown wolf head. I do remember, though, that it had longer muscles, but I didn't see any teeth or anything like that, or even glowing eyes. Once this thing hopped to the other side of the road, we didn't want to take any chances running into whatever this thing was. So, we floored it and got the hell out of there. Me and my buddy have done a lot of hunting together and have not really ran into anything weird like that. People have even mentioned to us about Bigfoot stuff out there that we go and have never found any tracks or even any real proof that it exists. I'm not saying we ran into a werewolf. I'm not saying we ran into a creature. It was just some large animal. Maybe it could have been an unknown dog. I'm not too sure. I wouldn't want to be caught alone with what we saw, though. I will definitely say that. I went camping with my wife and 3 children in a national state park in Northern California back in 1989. It's been so long now, I forget the name of the exact park. I had a very terrifying experience that is hard for me to recount sometimes, just due to the feeling like I've acquired some sort of PTSD from it. We had done some hiking and fishing for the day, and we're driving our camper into the national state park. We found a nice spot to pull over and get nestled down for the night. Everything went pretty normal. We went outside and we brought out the grill and had some burgers and just enjoyed the cool air and relaxed. After it got dark, we all decided to head in and get some shut-eye. Now, my children at the time were very young, 2, 4, and the oldest being 6. And of course, it makes it a little more scarier because it was a full moon this night, and so much of the area around our camper was actually illuminated by the moonlight. After falling asleep next to my wife in our bed, we were awoken at some point in the night by our 6-year-old daughter knocking on the door, saying there was some really big dog outside looking in the windows. I immediately just told her she was dreaming and to go back to sleep, But she was very persistent and sounded scared. I told my wife to stay in bed, and then I would get up and check it out. I got up and walked outside. I didn't really notice anything out of the ordinary. I didn't smell anything or even sense anything strange. I went back inside and told my daughter that there's nothing to worry about and that she should settle down. As soon as I told her that, whatever it was must have slammed as hard as it could into the side of our camper, because the entire thing shook like somebody drove headfirst into it at about 40 miles an hour. It knocked my daughter and I off of our feet, and my wife and younger children woke up and crying and screaming. The only thing I really had with me as a weapon was a baseball bat. So here I am in my pajamas, running outside with a bat, thinking somebody ran headfirst into the camper. I get outside to only experience total silence and the most eerie feeling I've ever felt. I'm not sure, for whatever reason, it was instinct or what was telling me, but I knew to turn to my right because I felt something was close by. I turned to my right, and sure enough, standing about 20 feet away from me, was the largest animal, whatever you want to call it, I've seen in my life. This thing was standing at least 10 feet tall. It was enormous. I never really watched horror movies or was into that sort of stuff. But if I had to tell you what a real-life werewolf would look like from the movies, this was it, in the living flesh. It was so massive, its body was like you took Arnold Schwarzenegger, covered him with black hair, gave him piercing yellow eyes, and long claws. It was darker since it was night, but like I said, the moonlight allowed me to see more than what you'd normally expect on a night since it illuminated so much. It was so black, it was like it was absorbing the light around it, so I couldn't see a lot of the finer details, like muscle definition. But I could see humongous teeth, and what looked to be a giant dog head on top of this abomination of nature. I immediately threw down my bat and ran back inside and locked the camper door. I wasn't sure if that would even hold it out, but I told my family to huddle down and to be as quiet as possible. I really kinda lost track of time after that, because all I remember is this thing pacing outside of our camper and growling every couple minutes. It never once tried to open the door or get into our camper. After a while, the sound seemed to dissipate, and I never went back outside to check if it was still there. The family and I eventually found our way to sleep, and we left the very next morning. I'm not sure what it was, but it's something I really don't like to talk about, and even writing this out was tough for me. I would honestly prefer just to forget about it forever. I'm an Idaho native and a retired police officer. Many years ago, when I was working as an on-duty cop, I had a strange occurrence happen to me that I was told I'm not allowed to talk about. But I feel now that I'm older, it's something I should mention before I pass. The rest of the force thought I was crazy, but you know what? I don't care. You can't explain what happened to my vehicle. It was probably around midnight, and I was on the 41 between Sturgeon and Spirit Lake, when the only thing I can describe as an extremely large wolf began running alongside my vehicle and showed extremely aggressive behavior. I began to speed up, and I immediately radioed I had an unknown animal chasing my vehicle, and whatever this thing was slammed into my car and scratched the whole side of it with whatever claws it had on it. I sped up even more and eventually lost track of it. But as I went further and got far enough away, I pulled over to the side of the road just to check the damage on the vehicle, and you could see long and deep scratch marks all along the side of the vehicle. I called for backup, and when they arrived, they weren't sure what to make of the whole ordeal. These are claw marks as big as grizzly bear claws, and there ain't nothing out there that's going to chase my vehicle at midnight and do that to the metal of the car. The next morning, I get a call from my supervisor who explicitly told me to never speak about it and do not tell anyone about it, even though at that point, I'd already told almost the whole force what had happened. This happened back in 1992, and although I didn't understand the circumstances of the time, I'm older now and I've looked into these kind of encounters. Some things I realize why now they keep things hush-hush. Pay attention to where you are and your surroundings, especially at nighttime, because even when you're an officer, things can still be dangerous. I live out and have lived out in a very rural area for most of my life without any issues at all. Where I live, there's a lot of clearing around my house, along with woods and a cornfield not too far away. This piece of property that I live on has actually been passed down from my grandparents, who originally settled here and built the house a very long time ago. I think since about the early 1900s. It's been fairly peaceful here, with a handful of farming and easy country life living. We stay out here and like it a lot because there's not really a whole lot of critters, and you get away from the busyness that is the city and everything that comes with it, like noise, crime, and people. Unfortunately, I'm learning out here it has its ups and downs too, with the odd things that have been happening. Only up until very recently, I've been experiencing some strange noises outside my house during the nighttime, but nothing that's really got me alarmed. One evening, I noticed some strange noises going on. It sounded like a bunch of growling, but I know there's really no other dogs in the neighborhood besides mine, so I thought that was strange. I go to look out my sliding glass door, and I see my Labrador barking his head off at this massive wolf human thing that was standing right by the cornfield. It looks like whatever this thing was had just stepped out from the cornfield into the clearing, and my dog was literally flipping shit. At this point, my dog is literally snarling and going crazy, and this thing is just standing there. Keep in mind, they're only about 20 to 30 feet away from each other, if I had to guess, and so now I'm freaking out because this thing looks mean enough to easily kill my dog. There's still plenty of daylight outside because it's starting to get dusky, but I could still see details. This thing had a massive, shaggy wolf head and a very lean, tapered waist, but it was very defined and very muscular. You could see it breathe, and even though it was shaggy, I could very much so make out the muscles on its abdomen and chest. Not quite ripped like a bodybuilder, but still very well built, and this thing had to have been pretty heavy. I can't really estimate what this thing weighed, but I guarantee you it could put some pounds. It looks like its arms were too long for its body though. I remember that and thought it was strange. After a moment or two of watching this go on, and not really sure what to do myself, this thing bared its teeth at my dog and got ready to attack. This thing sent my dog into a full frantic frenzy, running back to me whimpering, and as my dog was running back towards the house, this thing looked up over at the house and just stared at me through the window. I began to panic because I thought, what if this thing comes toward the house? What if it comes after me? What if it comes and tries to hurt us? But it never did. It just sat there and stared at us for another moment or two before turning around and going back into the cornfield the way it originally came. Even though it was roughly 100 or so yards away, I felt like it was staring into my soul, and that this being looked highly intelligent. I've never seen anything like it before, but I feel like it was more than just some unknown animal that we happened to run across. I thought it was some alpha predator, but for whatever reason, it seems more curious about my dog than it did threatened. It moved pretty quick too, because literally, within just a few seconds, it was long gone, and those cornfields are not really easy for traversing. After this happened to me, I decided to do a little bit of digging online, and I was surprised to find out how many other people have had occurrences just like mine with very similar beings. I'm honestly surprised I didn't have a more aggressive encounter. Even though the thing bared its teeth at my dog and was going to strike, it was very, I don't even know what you'd say. It just studied my dog at first, very curious, until it got ready to strike. But I'm very thankful and I'm counting my blessings. I still haven't seen any trace of it since then, and hope maybe it was just passing through the area and will leave me the hell alone. I live and have lived out in a very wild, rural area in Mississippi. I've lived out here just about my entire life, and I love it. I wouldn't change a thing. Waking up to the birds chirping in the morning and having all the wild critters around my property is one of the best things ever. I've never had any issues with predators attacking my livestock or anything like that. But lately, there seems to be a different story. In my area, I have probably about 6 or 7 other neighbors, and we're all fairly evenly spread out. All of my neighbors have livestock from horses, chickens, goats, cats, and dogs, you name it. My closest neighbor, bless her heart, has a couple pet raccoons and possums. She's almost 80 years old, and will bring any animal into her house as her own. Lately, though, some of her animals have been turning up missing. The neighbor on the other side of my property, a little further out, has been finding his chickens and goats mutilated. He's lost about 10 goats this past couple years, and well over a dozen chickens. There's really no big alpha predators in the area that would literally entirely mutilate an animal like this. It doesn't make any sense. These livestock aren't even being eaten, just torn to shreds. These animals look like they've been thrown into a meat grinder and emptied out into the ground. Like I said, I haven't noticed anything strange with any of my livestock, but I do keep a close eye out. One early morning, I was going on a stroll through some of the acreage that's behind my property, as I like to do from time to time. I noticed things kind of seemed out of place with how quiet it was. Usually, in the early morning, the forest is pretty alive with bird noises and little animals scurrying about. That wasn't the case this morning, though. Even though the sun was shining bright, it was still dead silent. I don't know too much about hunting, but it was pretty unnerving, to say the least. Not too far into the acreage is a small little lake. This thing isn't too large, maybe the size of a football field at most. So sometimes it's nice to be able to go back there and sit at the bank and just relax. That's where I was planning to go this morning, and even though I felt extremely uncomfortable with the total silence, I just did my best to ignore it. It only took me maybe about 5 or 10 or so minutes of walking before I made it to the clearing, or where I could clearly see the entire lake. I stopped to rest for a minute and just take in the view. Things seemed a little bit more eerie than they did just a moment ago. Things were still silent, and I started to feel the hair on my body raise up. I became very alert, like something was around, but I wasn't sure what. I suspected maybe a mountain lion was around, and I was being stalked. Just then, across the lake in the woods, I heard some crashing noises that sounded like a moose was stampeding through the woods. I was very puzzled by this, and within a second, I see this large, upright canine step right out of the woodline, take maybe 5 or 6 strides, and walk back into the other side of the woodline. Across the lake from me was another clearing that this thing walked into, but this clearing wasn't large. On one side of the woods, it was maybe about 30 to 40 feet where the other woods started, and that's where this thing walked into. All I could really see from where I was at was this large, gray wolf that was upright, just walking. I was more confused and puzzled than I was scared. I wasn't sure what to think, and so later on that day, I visited my neighbor and let her know what I saw. Beth, the one who has a ton of animals, told me that she didn't want to say anything because she didn't want anybody thinking she was crazy. But she has seen the same animal, the same large gray, upright canine on her property going after her livestock. Her husband had passed a long time ago, so she really had no means to chase it off or really defend herself. There's all sorts of unknown animals in the woods that we haven't discovered yet, and as long as it keeps its distance from me and my property, there won't be any problems. Back in 1990, I was living in Kane, Pennsylvania, where I worked with my wife's family, helping her father get his startup business going. Life was pretty normal for the most part, and even though I'm not really a country living type of person, I do enjoy where we live. Kane is a pretty small town, and so it was pretty simple living for a lot of the time. One evening, though, I was headed outside of town on Highway 6, headed east. I don't quite remember where I was on the road, but at some point, I was frightened when this large canine steps out onto the road, off to the other side of the road. It was later in the afternoon, but not quite evening yet. It was brown in color and had legs like a man. They did not bow back like a regular dog. It was weird. The head was enormous. It looks like a giant German shepherd. I thought it was a person in a suit at first because of how bizarre it was. And never once did it turn to look at me or anything like that. It just continued off and didn't pay attention to me. I didn't see any eye shine or anything. I didn't even see any teeth or anything, but I did notice its longer muzzle. It happened so fast I couldn't really recall what its hands looked like. Its strides were so big, I knew there was no way it could have been a person. At first, I thought it was a man in a suit or something, like I said, or maybe somebody was just playing a trick, but it looked just too realistic, and I'm still trying to convince myself that it wasn't what it was. but I feel like I know for sure it was what it was. It was also 7 or so plus feet tall, and that I can't really wrap my head around still. It was about 50 feet away when it came out onto the road and crossed, so I only slowed down a little bit. It was an amazing sight to behold, and even though I was a little fearful, I've talked to other people around town to see if they've seen anything weird or bizarre, and no one really talks about anything. My wife and her family have lived in this area for a long time, and they've never had any encounters with such an animal. Who knows? Maybe I just got lucky and got to see an animal nobody really else gets to see. It was only a few years after that we moved up to Maine and still live there. I've been back to Kane quite a few times since and have yet to see or hear anything like it. Idaho gets pretty flippin' hot in the summertime, especially depending on where you live. I've lived south of Boise now for about 5 or so years, back from 2008 to roughly about 2013, and it is such a breath of fresh air from the hustle and bustle of the East Coast. I used to live down in Tampa for a long time, but have since moved here for a change of pace and a different job field. Of course, moving out here, I never thought I would encounter anything like what I did, since living in Florida, it's pretty vanilla. I think I've heard about the skunk ape once or twice growing up, but have never given it any real thought. I've always just thought that stuff was made up. Anyway, it was May. I remember that much, and it was back in 2013, right before I had to move. And this particular night was pretty hot. I lived in a one-story house at the time, and my bedroom window is roughly 4 feet off the ground. My bed sits right next to my window, so as I'm laying down, I could literally reach over with my arm and close or open the window. Now, when I bought this house, it needed a bit of fixing up, and the windows all needed to be replaced. I fixed most of them, but they were still needing screens, and so of course for me, I hardly have ever opened my window, so I never really bothered putting a screen in. It wasn't quite hot enough for air conditioning just yet, so on this night, I thought, what the hell. I cracked my window a little bit and fell asleep. Well, it wasn't enough. I woke up sweating balls about 1 in the morning. I know because as soon as I woke up, I looked right up at my clock, got up, got some water, and then opened my window more because it was pretty hot. I didn't just open the window, I cranked that son of a bitch all the way open to let the cool air in. And for whatever reason, my room decided to just collect all the heat in the house and hold it in. I had a rough time falling back asleep, but the outside air was so nice and cool, it felt really good. I remember faintly waking up to the sound of heavy breathing and thought I was just half awake, half dreaming, so I brushed it off. I noticed the heavy breathing started to get louder and louder, and I started to feel like something wasn't right. I opened my eyes and looked in the direction of the heavy breathing, and outside, approaching my window about 20 feet away, was a werewolf. That's the only way I can describe it to you. It had glowing red eyes, and it had its teeth bared and claws out reaching for the open window. I screamed as loud as I could and jumped up and slammed the window shut. I quickly ran in my kitchen to grab a knife, and I prepared myself for an all-out war. I don't think I've ever went back to my bedroom. I just sat there, huddled on the kitchen floor, waiting for this monster to break in my house and get me. I was prepared to fight for my life. It was pretty quiet though, and nothing happened after that. I think maybe an hour or two later, I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I know, I'm waking up from the fetal position on my kitchen room floor with the knife still in my hand. I jump up and I immediately run back to my bedroom, and I see my window is still closed. Nothing disturbed. I run outside my house and search around where this thing was last night, and I find these humongous prints in the dirt. They were huge, easily 12 inches or more. I had a friend growing up who had a few Great Danes, and this paw print would dwarf even their paw prints. I thought to myself, great, I have a werewolf in the neighborhood. There's really nothing I could do or anyone I could talk to after that. Who's gonna believe me? To my luck though, I ended up getting a really good job offer roughly 3 hours away, closer to northern Idaho, and not even 2 weeks later, so I ended up moving. I'll never know what became of that creature, and I feel sorry for whoever ended up moving into that house. I hope they don't have the same nightly visitor that I did.